I'm just going to shut the window. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And this week, I'm delighted to have finally got the fabulous Andy Lancaster on the podcast. And it's a brilliant timing to have him on. Some of you will know him of CIPD, ex-CIPD. He's now got his own consultancy, Reimagine People Development, and he's the award-winning author of Driving Performance Through Learning and the brand new book, hot off the press, Organizational Learning Communities. So I'm really looking forward to delve into how we can build a learning community and why we might want to. But Andy, would you like to introduce yourself further?
Yeah, listen, great to be with you, and it's great to share this book. As we'll see in a moment, is really of its time. There's a real renaissance going on around thinking about communities and socialized learning. So yeah, really delighted to be with you today to share some thoughts around it, and hopefully to energize those listening about how they can perhaps be more intentional around their community strategy.
Absolutely. And I suppose almost taking a step back, because this is quite relevant. I've been talking to people recently about development conversations, and quite often people feel sort of traditional development is formal training. It's almost old school or e-learning or something, but a learning community, what is that? How is that different?
So learning community, if we step back, it's probably the most natural way that we learn. So if we go back to, to the earliest times, men and women predating language and certainly predating e-learning and those kind of lovely things that we deal with, this was how you learn to survive, how you learn to make fire, and how you learn to hunt. And we've got these wonderful cave paintings where you can see that through storytelling communities use socialized learning as a means to not only develop skills but to survive. And again, if we think about children, I initially trained as a teacher. So I go back to my teaching theory. Children generally learn, certainly in their earliest years, through observing and through role modeling, those kind of things. But also, it's really fascinating. And once I got into writing about this, the number of creatures in the natural world who rely on socialized learning for their well-being and for their survival is just incredible. And obviously, most people would be totally familiar with the concept of beehives and ants and those kind of things, which work together as almost like a hive mind. But there's also lots of other incredible ones, like starlings working in murmurations to fend off prey and to communicate, and even killer whales teaching their young how to create bow waves to knock seals off icebergs. So this, for me, listen, this was just embedded in how nature and the world works, and yet somehow we've lost something around this, and I think we need to get some more intentionality. So for me, I guess I tried to look for a definition. There were some definitions out there, but I kind of came up with my own, which underpins the book, and it's kind of got four parts. So for me, a learning community is a group connected and energized by a cause. Energized by a cause, we'll see in a moment, is really important. There's got to be a reason around this. Then the community have members who interact mutually, generously, and accessibly. So it's about connection and willingness to be connected. And then there's some real things that come out of this. So it's connection in sharing knowledge, spearheading practice, solving problems, seeding innovation, or supercharging development. So there's a number of really practical things that I found from the evidence around what communities achieve, and then to create impactful individual or group outcomes. So this is brilliant because it is about intrinsic motivation. This is about capturing people's imagination, moving away from one-size-fits-all learning to gathering groups of people together with connections to achieve sometimes the most incredible outcomes.
So it would almost be organic in us. I suppose you might have, I'm thinking, people who are gamers or people who code for fun. There might be organized people do it, individually in where people have a hobby. But we're talking here, how can you create it intentionally in an organization? Is that right?
Yeah, I think it is. I think you've made a really important point there about the organic nature of communities. If we went into any organization, and I think back my own history, CIPD, working in social housing, working in rehab, numbers of settings, there are absolutely organic communities which are taking place under the surface. And as people professionals, we need to recognize this. Often people are sharing and organizing informally behind the scenes. So it's not about taking those over, it's about actually resourcing them. So I think for me, it is informal, but there also is a real skill around this and intentionality about how do we develop communities, because I think once we think about designing for socialized learning, we've got a real potential to capture hugely powerful ways that organizations have of developing people and lots of other outcomes. So it's both, I think.
Okay, good. So so if we were going to, I'm someone in an organization, you work with organizations, and you're consulting on this topic. Why might I want to come and talk to you, and how would you guide me, or what would be your sort of are there certain circumstances why it would be most appropriate for us to look at something like this?
Yeah, I think there's actually the Renaissance. I think is for a very good reason, and this is my kind of thinking. But I think you can begin to see these threads elsewhere. There is a desire for human connection, and I think we're well past COVID and pandemic. But my experience, and I don't know whether yours is the same, that many organisations are really looking to foster reconnection. Many organisations have become fragmented, so this is a brilliant way of thinking about how do we create those connections with people. And for me, in a world of AI, and I'm hugely passionate and positive about the role of AI in people practice, but we don't want to lose the human connection with me just interfacing with a large language model. So I think there's a couple of things there, and also we're seeing cost effectiveness is so important for organisations. Budgets are tight for most organisations, and socialised learning communities are incredibly cost-effective way of designing and delivering learning. So I think there is a kind of almost a perfect storm, but in a good way, as to why we want to do this. And I think what I've also found in the book was really interesting, that the number of research studies which are now showing this, the re-emergence of this. So I was involved with CIPD's Learning at Work 2023. Again, peer collaboration was in the top 6 development methods. Around about 30% of organizations were now using this. And what was really interesting in terms of technology, it was the 3rd highest activity alongside virtual classes and the use of learning management systems. So it's definitely on the rise. And again, LinkedIn Learning Report, Research Report 2023 showed that things like it was over 90% of organizations found that community-based learning contributes to a sense of belonging and engagement. So I think it captures a lot of those things. And then in a moment, I guess we can unpack why you would do this. There's got to be a cause around this. But I think there's just a number of factors where savvy people professionals are just recognizing it's time to rethink this and revisit it.
So I really I suppose what I'm trying to do is visualize it. I understand it conceptually, and I'm wondering, I've got a number of questions, and I'll go in no particular order. The first one is, when we talked about social learning, is it the same thing when people talk as in learning, so peer-to-peer learning? What examples fit into a learning community? Are there lots of different varieties of learning, but the basic point is it's humans? And I suppose second question, I'm assuming it can be done virtually. It doesn't have to be done face to face.
Yeah, so, really good. Yeah.
Is it social, or what is it?
So if you think very quickly about the underpinning theories, social learning theory stems back to a guy called Albert Bandura, who said that most human behavior is learned observationally from being with others, and most of us would recognize that's the case. And there's also a guy called Vygotsky did a theory called social constructivism, which is where we create environments where we connect and we can be developed. So that's the kind of theory behind it. But I think once you go, when I was talking to folks around this, when we talked about learning communities, most people knee-jerk to think about communities of practice, which is where people might gather around a particular theme or particular professional passion. But what I found, there's a whole bunch of activities which come under socialized learning communities. So for instance, some of the other things we'd know, action learning sets, we gather people together to work together to face into opportunities or challenges, coaching and mentoring circles, study support groups. Many organizations have people on formal programs and gather together these kind of socialized groups to provide support. Working out loud circles, John Stepper's principles about allowing people to just be able to look in on what we're doing. And the other one, which is just fascinating, the number of organizations running book clubs. A book club is a socialized learning activity. Generally, we're gathering with a tea or coffee or refreshments, even a piece of cake, to really discuss a particular theme. So I think for me, there are social learning communities appear in a number of guises, which we probably know. But I think at the crux of this is beginning to get intentional in our thinking and design, and recognizing what we're doing, but also then pushing the boundaries and thinking about activities which have social underpinnings, which really help develop people.
So that's, I can get that. So it's not just a group of people with their sort of hobby. It's got an intent. Does that mean I suppose what comes first? Is there a right or wrong on this in terms of, is it the topic, so you've got an intent to learn a certain subject, or is it the group that's intent is to learn together, if that makes
Yeah.
sense? Which comes first?
Yeah, my take is where I failed, and I use the word fail deliberately because I have. Gathering communities for community's sake is very tricky and very difficult and often doesn't work. And we've all done this, I suspect, those listening in. In fact, if you've been through this, those listening in, don't panic. You're not alone. You get some people together, there's huge energy, it goes off with a massive bang, everybody's up for it. And then maybe a couple of months later, it just kind of dwindles and then no one is kind of getting involved. So that I think is problematic. Where I found communities really work is where there's an absolute cause at the center of this. There's a reason for them. So let's give you an example, a great one. Buddying. We all know about buddying working really well, but onboarding is a brilliant opportunity for us to use socialized means for people onboarding. You might have a formal program, you might have some checklists, but having human connections on onboarding, for me, when I was the head of HR, made such a difference. So I think what I would suggest is the evidence would show that it needs to be addressing an organizational need of some kind. There's got to be a reason for this. Okay, you could run a hypothetical, you could run a community which just hangs around, maybe a community of interest where people engage, informally. But I think it's looking at, and in the book, I use the term friction, which you often see used in customer service. Where's the friction going on? And it's those friction points, those organizational development opportunities, often which are the places where communities can thrive.
So I get, so it needs to be a sort of pragmatic purpose for it. Does that mean, therefore, that you might have multiple learning communities within one organization, and you'd have a buddying one, or how would it? Yeah, so you'd have it. It's topic or purpose led.
Yeah, and I think right at the end of the book, I was trying to, because it's quite a chunky book. There's a lot of evidence in it, but right at the end, you think, how do you start this? First of all, look for the causes, look for the energizers, look for the things that are going on. So it could be, for instance, how about transitioning into your first line management role? We know that's a really challenging time for most of us when we went through that. So that's a great place where you could run a community, and from that, you can then work out which socialized means. It could be it could be action learning, it could be whatever, it could even be a book club running. So start with the cause, then look at how you might want to gather people around. And I think there's a huge empowerment piece here as well, where sometimes I've got it wrong, is the center trying to control these things. I think sometimes we need to work with people and say, what would you like, what would really help you? So I think that's the best starting place for it. And again, if you stumble across these communities in your organization, because they will absolutely be there, don't walk into the party and make a lot of noise. Join the party, and resource it. So I think sometimes we've got a great starting place working with one organization. We're actually doing a soft audit of where we think this is going on in the organization to support and encourage these groups already.
Okay, so that's something, perhaps I'm going to come back to that. In fact, I'm going to come back to sort of what works and what doesn't for people who are trying to do it out there. But you talked about there being lots of evidence. You've done loads of research, and I think this whole evidence-based practice is really useful for people. So could you share some evidence as to that would convince people this is worth doing, or any of the particularly standout bits of evidence that you share?
Yeah, so for me, I mean, there were 5 key things which I found communities do well. This is not the only ones, and this is where I delved into the research. So for instance, I've got sharing knowledge. We know knowledge management and knowledge sharing is very problematic in organizations. In fact, I go back to some of my people practice, and in fact, the information and the knowledge sharing was managed by the IT department with a platform, and it didn't work. That was the reality around this. So we know in sharing knowledge, things like James Ricky's wisdom of crowds, although we've got to be a little bit careful because there are biases and issues around that. We know there's great evidence around communities working around decision making, continuous improvement, shared expertise, those kind of things. So it's a brilliant way. I mean, and you've probably had this, Lucinda. I've been in organisations where someone's left the company or left the organisation. You think, my goodness, Sue's gone. We're in trouble now because all of that information has just left the building or left the organisation. So there is no doubt that knowledge sharing is one of those. Another one is spearheading practice. Great, fascinating thing. Now, we're obviously, we've got more than the UK audience here, but in the UK, we have these things called guilds, worshipful communities, which go back to the 1800s, where each profession had its own guild, where it trained up novices, beginners, got them into good practitioners, and then you have your masters and experts. And I was speaking not too long ago in London at the Worshipful Society of Launderers. That's as in people who iron laundry. I guess in the olden days, these people would have been in the state, but they had a practice, they had a worshipful guild. So you trace this back. So if you're really serious in your organization about practice development, there's a huge history around socialized communities doing that. And again, things like problem solving, heuristic approaches, creative approaches to problem solving. You can definitely do that by getting people together. Innovation, again. And one I use around innovation, which is just a fascinating one. We all look at Apple and we think this is the most, and here's my Apple iPhone, in front of the camera here. We think about Apple, and we think about the spaceship HQ. We forget that Apple started in a garage in Menlo Park in California, the Homebrew Computer Club. So we look at Apple now, we think, oh, if only we're like Apple, but we forget it started in a garage. So this is some of the evidence from the book, many, many examples that socialized gatherings and communities are the seedbed for the most amazing outcomes.
So with that, though, a lot of them, they don't necessarily start with the vision that they're going to be a socialized learning community. They're a socialized learning community, and they get good outcomes, and therefore they're successful. If you said to me, they don't start by saying we're going to do it this way, do they?
Yep. Yeah, and that's a great one, isn't it? I mean, again, people listening in will probably have this. Often, I was going to say senior leaders, but that sounds very judgmental. Want the end point, but without going to the start point. And the start point is actually we gather people together who have got a passion and an energy around something. Where this goes, who knows? I think back to my time working. I worked in social housing with older folks with dementia, one of the main care services. And we had a group there who were top dementia specialists, and they developed their own community of practice. So if someone was getting some slightly challenging behavior with, or whatever, they just went to their community, and those folks shared really passionately and really generously. So again, I think it comes around the cause. You then get the people together, and then you see the most amazing outcomes. But I guess you could reverse engineer it. If you're looking for more innovation, why not gather great diverse groups of people? We know diverse groups are great at innovation. Why not create the environments where these things can happen?
And that's the interesting thing. So I suppose if we go into the audience that's listening to this, so lots of people, there might be L&D people, there might be HR people in larger organizations, or they might be an HR department of one. And one of the things you can often find is the example of companies that are so busy doing that they don't find time to stop and reflect. So you talked about continuous improvement. So sometimes continuous improvement doesn't happen because that time isn't prioritized, if you like. And it seems to me that that's where a learning community, in terms of continuous improvement, could be really useful. But is the motivation there to do it? So if you are a person in an organization as the HR L&D, the catalyst, I suppose, what is your role? Because you're saying you said you're going to audit in one of the companies, you're auditing it to see where it is. So you don't want to meddle with it. If it's working, great. But if your company isn't learning and it could benefit from it, what would you do and where would you start?
Yeah, so I came up with a simple model, and let's be very careful on models because we know they're often oversimplified. But exactly this, Lucinda, I was trying to work out what's a simple model for, and I think back to times where I was a singleton in an organization running learning. So the 7 C's model I've come up with. Firstly, we've already talked about this. It's got to have a cause at the beginning. So you've got to get around something which needs some energy. Culture is definitely something we as people professionals, we know about this. So there is an aspect about developing trust, psychological safety, about thinking about inclusion, because diversity is really important. Things like altruism, bias. So we can look at how do we support culture. We can't obviously necessarily create it, but we can think about the dynamics. And certainly the communities which I've been in, which have been really effective, it is totally okay to turn up and be yourself. And that's really important that we do have psychological safety around that. A few other quick ones. Conditions we need to think about: is it face-to-face? Is it digital? Is it hybrid? Is it synchronous or asynchronous? Do we do stuff together? So there's some definite conditions where you can create the right environments for this. Cadence is another C I've got, which is about rhythm. Most communities that do really well have some kind of rhythm associated with them, where you know what's going to be going on so that you connect with it. Then 3 other quickies. Content strategies. It's really important to be seeding the community with great information, thinking about contributions. How do we encourage people not to be lurkers, but to take part. And the last one I've got is credit, which is really thinking about how do we, thank people and reward people for being part of these communities, either through things like digital badging is very common now, you'll see amongst communities, or even assigning roles. So that 7Cs model is almost like the DNA where, to encourage those listening, think, oh my goodness, this is another big thing to do. There are some key things you can look at, very pragmatic things to get alongside communities to really make them rock.
So again, you're sort of getting alongside them, or I suppose you might start it by identifying a cause, a common cause and a problem or pain point that people have got, and gathering them together, creating the space and time. Or cadence, I suppose, is almost getting people, inviting people, facilitating it starting in some way. Would that be how you do it?
Yeah. And on cadence, I mean, most things, we don't recognize it now, but thank goodness our hearts are beating. We don't even realize it, but there's rhythm going on. And again, we might think about a community. It might be to say, actually, this group of people, we will get them together once a quarter for some kind of face-to-face where we can build those relationships. But then on a monthly basis, we're going to put a problem out there, which we're going to work on together. On a weekly basis, someone is going to share something working out loud. So I think in a sense, it's interesting that there's another theory which kind of hangs around this one, which is around scaffolding, which is Jerome Bruner's theory of learning, which is where we scaffold environments to enable people to flourish. So I think in some ways, as people professionals, we are the scaffolders around this. We may not necessarily do all the building, but what we do is we create the conditions and we coach and enable people to get the right fertile soil where these things can just take off.
And that might be about sort of encouraging the trust and giving the give and take, or recognizing people who are doing it and just giving the space for it to sort of flourish.
Yeah, I mean, one situation I had, which I won't say which organisation, but some of the aspects of the organisational culture was not where it needed to be. So what do? If you create a community, in a sense, by nature, that DNA comes in because you're in the organisation. But it is quite possible, and the analogy I use is it's quite possible, like the Eden Project in the southwest of England, creates these biomes, almost these different cultures where you can do things differently. So part of our role as people professionals, if we've got some challenges around culture, is to work with a group of people to say, how do we now model trust and psychological safety if there may be issues elsewhere? And often that's about role modeling. Again, it comes back to Bandura. As we role model these things, we can do it. So I think as people professionals, this is just so exciting for me because I've played with this stuff and I've seen it. Again, I worked in rehab for a time where working with people with major addiction issues, we actually used community as a means for their therapy. That's how it worked. You were in a role modeled community. That's how you dealt with the things you were going through. So I've seen the transformational power of community. So for me, this is dead exciting. I think this is something we can all grab and use.
So on that, I was thinking, is that like having a sponsors or something like that? People who've been there a bit, like I suppose if it's an addiction, someone might have a sponsor or someone who sorts them through. In a business, you might have someone who's done that transition to line manager and knows what you need to learn, and sort of a mentor buddy kind of thing. So I can see that.
I've got that. I mean, I've got that under culture. That as champion sponsor is really important, and often as senior leader, we know with a lot of people ventures that actually senior leader sponsorship is really important. So I've got that under culture, that considering who your champion sponsor might be really important. And there's a great case study at NASA where they launched a community which didn't work, and one of the reasons they cited as to why it didn't work, they didn't have senior leader buy-in. And what's interesting is often we say to a senior leader, can we go on a course or a program? Surely that's okay. If we say, can we have half an hour out of our work schedule to engage in a socialized learning activity? Well, that's a bit of a waste of time, isn't it? So we've got to re-educate senior leaders that this is a really powerful way for people development.
It's that kind of free space, freedom to think, kind of, this is one of the coaching things, isn't it? The time to think. So when you referred then to something that didn't work, what other things don't work that we need to be careful of? What would you say are the watch outs around something like this?
Assuming people can do this, I mean, we could all socialize, and essentially you and I are chatting here, we can do this kind of thing. But within organizations, there's an assumption that, for instance, we're good at networking, and that's something we have to work on. The kind of peer coaching is often inherent in this, that we're getting alongside each other, we're encouraging. So again, often there's some underlying coaching skills which we might need to develop. Use of technology is another biggie. Most communities now, we're quite fortunate if it's just face to face. Most people are spread now. So, it's about putting technologies in. But again, NASA found that the induction process was not strong enough for people to be able to leverage the technology. So there is a piece around how do you start a community well, and the kickoff is really important in that induction. So there's a number of aspects, just like any initiative, isn't it? I think we need to engage people and think it through, but certainly the conditions. It's really interesting. There's a university in the UK called Ravensbourne University, right next to the O2 in London, in East London, and they've designed the building for socialised learning. If you can get down there, it's absolutely brilliant. I spent a morning down there just watching. So essentially what they've done is they've designed the building to enable people to connect. And it means there's movable spaces, there's all sorts of connective spaces. So again, sometimes we just don't think through enough of what people might need for this to succeed. So it is about listening to people, what they might need. It might be as simple as we need some space, or we need some free coffees or whatever it might be. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess if you can't get your desk, that makes it really hard to do something like that, full stop. Or if people get on a call and they switch off, they're not actually engaged. If that's the sort of culture that you've got with people on big group calls, it's not going to take off. So you've got to get that sort of link. So that makes sense as well. That sort of kickoff, that resonates where I think about successful teams, because in some ways a learning community is a team if you've got a purpose, and you're working together and you're with a shared goal, I guess, in many ways, in terms of this sort of link. And if you have the energy and the engagement and that sense of belonging, it could really feel. How is it different from a team, actually? Would you say is that an analogy for it? Or what's the difference?
Yeah, I mean, team often gathers around function for me, I think. It's a great question, that one, isn't it? Good question. I think for me, yeah, it is a great one, isn't it? I think for me, this is gathered around a particular cause, which is cross-departmental, cross-functional often.
Yep.
I think that's
it feels
often
broader, doesn't it? It feels broader than a team.
It does.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the powers of socialized learning spaces is diversity. So we're actually getting people from different disciplines sometimes to come together. You're breaking down some of that siloed stuff. So I think teams often we're focused on function, we're focused on a particular area of operational business, whereas often where these work really well is where, for instance, you might gather people around. Let's take the first line manager one. When you progress into management roles, to have a mixed group there sharing their experiences is more than a team. That's a whole strata of the organization. So I think I would definitely be promoting looking wider to get diversity into the group, because that's where some of the magic happens.
I mean, I do think obviously diversity in a team makes a team more effective if you can accept it, but I feel that it feels like a team might have a sort of or an effectively has quite a laser focus, and actually a learning community, you've got to be able to think more widely, haven't you? You've got to be broader and take that time back. So it's a philosophical question, isn't it? Anyways,
what I found was there's certain communities which happen in teams. So I've got one called development groups, and often that is a team. That's the kind of stuff you do at a team meeting, where you might do something around meaningful conversations. So some of the learning communities I found are definitely team based, so you can do those kind of things. Sometimes communities of practice, those kind of things in teams. But if you, for instance, take a study support group, that's another great community. Most organizations have some kind of formal learning, and you wrap around a study support group for people who are maybe doing a qualification. That's a cross-functional thing, and that's where the richness comes. So again, the 10 communities I found, and they're detailed in the book, you can probably spot the ones that are more inherent in localized teams and the ones which are probably pan-organizational, which add a different sort of value.
Got you. So I won't get you to go through all 10 on this, but did you say you've identified 10 different types of learning community that you'd recognize? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So there's 10 I found, and some of these we know, some of these we absolutely know. I think the one which has been most interesting for me is working out loud, Lucinda. That's one people have kind of heard of, but there are now definite groups and communities that are using working out loud as a method of development. So this is more intentional, and there's things called working out loud circles based on John Stepper's thinking, where you may gather for 12 weeks or whatever, and you actually do this working out loud. I look at your work, you look at mine, we discuss these kind of things. So again, and that's another interesting thing on the cadence, on the rhythm. We sometimes think communities just go on forever. I think one thing I've really learned is sometimes they have a shelf life, and it's okay. You might run an onboarding community, a buddying thing for the first 8 weeks, then it stops. and people probably keep those relationships. So again, I think we've got to be really clear that sometimes we think we've failed because the community's gone quiet, but whereas maybe it's just hit shelf life and we need to move on to the next thing.
Yeah, because they might need to learn something new, or learn from different people, and that makes quite a lot of success,
Yeah,
a lot of sense. The working out loud thing, I'm sure some people will be listening to this and they're not quite sure
yeah,
what that means. Would you explain
yeah.
that?
Yeah, it's a great one. Just go and Google it. But the analogy I use is working in a greenhouse. You know, people can look in at what you're doing. Even better, they can actually come in and have a look. So, for instance, right now, I'm working. Let me just give you an example of something I'm working on. So, I'm looking at how do we leverage communities in metaverse spaces. So, when I say metaverse, this is digital, you know, yeah, virtual spaces. So this is you and me actually not just talking on Zoom, actually hanging around in a virtual space together. I would simply be sharing what I'm looking at, what I've been reading, what challenges I might have, and I get into the practice, whether it be through social networking. Now, obviously, you can do this on LinkedIn or X or whatever, but within an organization, you can intentionally be sharing this stuff. So you'd have some brilliant projects you're working on where I think I've learned stuff from you. So this is about intentionally sharing. I think the genius on this is the stuff which I maybe think is obvious is absolute revelation for someone else.
Mm.
So we get so used to stuff we know, whereas someone else would just say, that's just incredible. I didn't realize that. So it is about working out loud. It's about allowing people to see, and you creating a narrative, a narration of what you're doing so that others can have a look at what you're doing. And it's a very, very powerful way of learning.
When would you do that? Would you do it when someone's in the same discipline as you, or when someone isn't? Is it completely understanding a different part of the business? When would that be
It
something
could
to
be
do?
it could be both. But the ones I've enjoyed are the ones where I'm working with people who do completely different things to me, and then you know, so this is this concept of adjacent communities, you know, where you hang around with people who might have something to do with you, but they're doing something, you learn something profound. So, for instance, here's a classic one. I was trying to think about the use of the metaverse for communities. And my son, even though he's a lot older now, went in and he was on Minecraft. In Minecraft, those who don't know what Minecraft, it's a virtual world which kids play in and all this kind of thing. And there's me trying to wrestle down metaverse in the organizational setting. I'm just thinking, hang on a minute, he's in this without me even thinking about it. So for me, hanging around with people in the gaming communities who might be working out loud gives me the most brilliant insights as to how I might be able to use that for myself. So again, hanging around with people you disagree with is also very cool. Because they might really irritate you, but you know sometimes they've got masses of wisdom which you can just learn. So yeah, so I think yeah, do hang around with diverse people, see what they're working on because you can learn brilliant stuff from them.
There's it's an interesting angle there, which I was going to. One of the things that comes through for me is I thinking culturally, and you've got culture as one of your C's. You need to have to do working out loud as you described it. You need to have quite a high trust culture where people are not threatened by Big Brother or someone watch. Why do you want to watch me? Or you know that sort of thing. It's to do that in a high trust environment to feel comfortable with that. But also you've got to have people who have a high level of inquisitiveness and who are interested. And I suppose that, and some of that's, I mean, clearly you are a learning professional, you are passionate about learning. It's one of your things.
Yep.
Not everybody will feel the same way. So are there certain people who don't fit in that sort of environment, or you drag kicking and screaming and never going to get anywhere with? Is there any to avoid there?
It's a great one, isn't it? I think most people, most, not all, are altruistic. In other words, they are generous with what they've got. I certainly find that in the people profession. That's not just a learning thing, that's with OD professionals, with HR. Most people are generous. So I think we are willing to give it away. Now, in some organizations, there is no doubt that knowledge is power. So you don't see it being given away because it maintains someone in their position or their strata or whatever. But that's rare. I think it does happen. And I think altruism is something where I've met people who have freely given to me. It's infectious that you appreciate that and give back. So I think it's definitely something which most people are good at. I think your point around we can just be so busy, that's true. But I think you made a really important point a few minutes ago about reflection and stopping and thinking is so important. We're all on this organizational treadmill and it's brutal, you know. So sometimes stopping and maybe stopping and thinking, having a coffee with someone or whatever is absolutely brilliant. And that's where the socialized thing kicks in. So So yeah, I think it can be done, but again, I would rather hang around altruistic people. It's just great, isn't it? Where, in the sense we're doing this now,
Yeah.
we're just sharing this. Whoever's listening out there, I don't know who you are, but have this stuff. It's just great to be able to share what we're up to.
And I think that's actually the altruism. If the key often to kick this sort of thing off is by give something to someone else, you help someone else, and then they'll either pay it forwards or they'll help you back. It's the sort of reciprocity principle, but some people are more naturally giving, some people are a bit more reserved, but as long as it's kicked off in some way, and that's part of generating that culture. And you've also said recognizing, giving credit to people who are doing that, then as an organization you start to build that positivity around it. Now, I'm conscious of time because we could talk about this on and on. I suppose just a closing down, I suppose, any sort of top tips, and also before that, maybe, why would you want to do that? I think it's quite clear. If you said at the start it was about engagement, impact. Obviously, I used to work for Siemens, and they used to have an adage which is, if only Siemens knew what Siemens knew. And actually that's a great example of where, if you had, I'm sure other companies do it too, but sharing learning communities, that's the problem. We never stop to think. We make the same mistakes over and over again. You've got to be more effective if we are stopping and learning. But you might have a couple of examples from research that you've done. So if there's anything else that someone's thinking, I want to do this, but I've got to create a business case to slow people down, to give people permission to take 45 minutes having a coffee with somebody in our organization that's running really quickly. So anything evidence-based, and then if you want to, any top tips.
And we'll definitely do a top tip on impact, because someone's going to be out there thinking, how the heck do you manage the impacts of these things? Because you need to. Let me give an example. So Bloomberg, I've got an example in the book. So Bloomberg are, that they provide in the moment information, often around
shares and stuff, isn't it?
And financial. Now they have developed, I thought this was genius, they have developed a guild model within Bloomberg, and they're calling it guilds. And in fact, I found another organization who are using the term guilds, which is very interesting. But they've looked at their specialisms, be that C++, Java, machine learning, natural language processing, all these kind of things. And they have now began to look at the guilds in their organization, which they want to develop, and are then putting in place the kind of infrastructure around that to encourage people to do that. So I think if I was working with an organization, or if you're in your organization, I would step back and think, do we have guilds here? So certainly in social housing, in the one I worked in, we definitely had some stuff around dementia practice. That was absolutely a guild, which you could call it that. That word may not be appropriate for everybody, but I think that is a brilliant starting place to think, where are the specialisms we need to develop. So that's definitely one which I think is worth having a look at. And I think on impact, let's just call this one out. I mean, this is one of the most cost-effective ways of developing people. Absolutely be assured of that. Often the cost of a book club in organizational learning communities, I do the ROI in a book club, which is stunning, and that was even with buying the books and a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. And the impact, this was one on email practice, which I looked at. But there is a real thing. We've got to think about, how do we demonstrate practice? And there is some very, very clear stuff around the importance of narratives around communities. It doesn't mean that narratives and qualitative feedback is not as powerful as quant, although often senior managers want numbers. But there's some great thinking around telling stories. And I think we've got to get much better in people practice around telling the story. What has this community enabled me to do? And this is going back a few years. I saw one organization who created a management ebook on the impact of their management development program. And I saw the senior exec, who was proud of this, actually showed this thing to say, these are the stories of what's been going on in our organization. So we all know in marketing, often the story is really important. So if you're asking, how do you measure the impact? You can do ROI. It's absolutely possible to do it. But I would start off, as the community launches, or if it's already going, grab the stories about how these social interactions have either innovated practice, solved problems, all these kind of things, because those stories are absolutely gold.
And they're really powerful, and people buy into it. And again, that's a social, I suppose it's social. The stories are social. It kind of fits, isn't it, with the context of it?
Yeah.
Fabulous. So, Andy, we could obviously talk on and on about this, but we won't, because we've reached time. And people can go and get your book, can't they, at the end of the day? So Organizational Learning Communities, you can see it up on the screen here by Comb Page, and I'll put the link to it in the show notes. So if you want to go and just go to hruprising.com to this episode, and you can go and access the link directly there. Andy, brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on the HR Uprising podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Lucinda, and happy to connect with anybody. We can do this via LinkedIn, but thanks for the opportunity
Oh
to
yeah,
chat.
do you want to just say, sorry, Andy, like I said, or your email is andy@reimaginepeopledevelopment.com.
Yeah, it's quite long, but yeah, Reimagine People Development is my consultancy. Very happy if people want to contact around that or connect on LinkedIn. But Lucinda, great to talk to you. And honestly, let's grab. I think there's a renaissance. This is the time for us to do this. So let's grab this and make this a really powerful development tool for our organisations.
Absolutely. Or even virtually, professionally. I think we
There we
should set
go.
one of those
Yeah,
up.
yeah, beyond it. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
amazing. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks.